The restaurant, once a stage for vanity, became that night a setting for a greater truth, that a person's greatness isn't measured by their bank account, but by their impact on others' lives. Clara held little Sophia in her arms, humming melodies only she knew, while 6-year-old Michael played with the linen napkins beside them. The Bellinis glowed with its crystal chandeliers, each table adorned with white orchids imported from Thailand. The elegant murmur of conversations mingled with the soft clinking of Dom Perignon champagne flutes, creating a symphony of opulence that she observed with tired but watchful eyes. 3 tables away, Enzo Bellini gesticulated with a glass of 2015 Barolo in hand, his voice cutting through the air with the precision of a knife. At 42, he commanded any room with his imposing presence, his graying hair swept back, his tailored Armani suit perfectly molding his athletic physique. His icy blue eyes scanned the room with the arrogance of someone born to lead. "You know how hard it is to find qualified help these days," he said, his voice dripping with disdain as he subtly gestured towards Clara. Clara didn't need to hear the words to feel the weight of his judgment. She knew that look, that posture, that tone of voice that reduced human beings to mere objects of ridicule. At 28, her appearance was deliberately understated. Brown hair pulled back in a simple bun, a modest navy blue dress, simple black flats. Nothing about her screamed for attention, nothing hinted at the whirlwind of experiences she carried within. Sophia started to whimper, her tiny fingers clutching Clara's dress. It was time for a diaper change. Clara carefully rose, balancing the child in her arms while holding her diaper bag with the other hand. Michael, noticing the movement, decided to follow. But in his 6-year-old haste, he bumped into the table beside him, causing an embroidered linen napkin to slide to the floor. The silence that followed was deafening. As if an invisible conductor had stopped an orchestra mid-symphony, all conversation ceased. All eyes turned to Clara, who quickly bent down to pick up the napkin, Sophia still in her arms. "Well," Enzo said, his voice cutting through the silence like an axe, "it seems our caregiver isn't quite up to the standards of this establishment, is she?" The laughter that followed was strained, forced, but still echoed through the room like a cruel taunt. Clara felt a blush rise to her cheeks, not of shame, but of a deep sadness she knew all too well. It was the same feeling she'd had years ago, when the world she knew crumbled like a house of cards. Vienna, 5 years prior. The Musik Verein, golden and majestic, every seat filled with people who had come specifically to hear her play. Clara Montero, at 23, was considered one of the most promising violinists of her generation. Her small but incredibly skillful hands mastered the instrument with a passion that transcended technique. That night, she was to play Brahms' Violin Concerto in D major, a piece she'd known since she was 12, when her teacher at the Brasilia Music School said she had the gift of the angels. But the phone rang 2 hours before the performance. Her mother's trembling voice on the other end brought news that transformed music into noise, harmony into chaos. Her father, the man who had encouraged her to pursue her dreams, who had sold his car to pay for her private lessons, who cried with emotion whenever she played, had been in an accident. He was critically injured. Clara canceled the performance. She canceled her contract with the Vienna Philharmonic. She canceled her dreams and returned to Brazil to be by the side of the man who had given her everything, including music. Back in the present, Clara took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. She had learned to carry pain with grace, to transform humiliation into silent strength. Sophia stopped crying, as if sensing the determination emanating from her caregiver. "Michael," she said softly, her voice filled with a gentleness that contrasted with the harshness of the environment, Let's go to the restroom to change your sister, okay? But Enzo wasn't finished. He rose from his table, his imposing 6'1" frame towering over the other guests. His blue eyes gleamed with a cruelty that seemed to give him pleasure. "Hold on a moment," he said, walking towards Clara with slow, deliberate steps. "Don't you think we should establish some basic rules of etiquette? After all, we're in one of the finest restaurants in the city, not a daycare center." Clara stopped where she was, Sophia still in her arms. She could feel the eyes of all the guests on her, some with curiosity, others with pity, many with the same disdain that Enzo displayed so openly. She knew this type of person. She had spent years rubbing shoulders with them in the European classical music circuit. People who measure worth by zeros in a bank account, who believed that money was synonymous with moral superiority. "Mr. Bellini," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I apologize for the inconvenience. I will take care of the children and ensure there are no further interruptions." "Ah, but that's precisely what worries me," Enzo continued, his smile growing crueler. "You see, my sister may have a soft spot for charity cases, but I have standards. Frankly, I don't know if you—" He paused dramatically, letting his eyes rake Clara from head to toe. "Well, let's say, if you're really prepared to handle children in such a sophisticated environment." Enzo's words were like daggers, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. Clara felt a familiar ache spread through her chest, the same ache that had accompanied her for the past few years as she rebuilt her life from scratch. 2 years after her father's accident, Clara found herself in a children's hospital in Vienna, not as a renowned musician, but as a volunteer. She had sold her Stradivarius violin to pay her father's medical bills, and now survived by giving private music lessons. But the afternoons at the hospital were her way of finding purpose again. That's where she met Isabella, an 8-year-old girl who had lost her mother in a car accident. The child didn't speak, didn't eat, didn't show any interest in life. The doctors were worried, the psychologists frustrated. That's when Clara showed up with a borrowed violin, a cheap instrument she'd gotten from a pawn shop. "May I play for you?" she asked softly, sitting beside Isabella's bed. The girl didn't respond, but Clara began anyway. It wasn't Brahms or Vivaldi, but a simple melody, something she had composed in childhood when she still believed that music could heal any pain. Day after day, Clara returned. Day after day, she played. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Isabella began to respond. First, it was just a flicker of the eyes, then an almost invisible smile, finally whispered words. "Can you teach me to play too?" Isabella asked one autumn afternoon, her small hands reaching for the violin. Clara cried that day. She cried because she realized that, even though she had lost her career, even though she had lost her dreams, she could still make a difference in someone's life. She could still use her music to heal. Back in the present, Clara looked directly into Enzo's eyes. There was no defiance in her gaze, no anger, no resentment. There was only a deep tranquility, a peace that came from knowing one's own worth, regardless of what others thought. "I understand your concern," she said, her voice maintaining the same calm. "But I can assure you the children are well cared for. They are my priority." Enzo laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the hall. "Your priority? Darling, you can barely take care of yourself. Look at you. Look where you are. Do you really think you belong in this world?" That's when Clara realized something that made her smile inwardly. Enzo was trying to publicly humiliate her, but he didn't know she had already been demolished years ago. He didn't know that she had already lost everything that mattered and had found a way to rebuild her life on the rubble of her shattered dreams. He didn't know that humiliation, to her, was just another discordant note in a symphony she had already learned to play. And it was at that moment, when the silence in the hall became almost palpable, that a powerful voice cut through the air like thunder. "Clara?" Everyone turned to see who had spoken. There, standing in the entrance to the main hall, was Giancarlo Bellini, the owner of the restaurant. At 55, he was an imposing figure, with graying hair and brown eyes that usually shone with pride and authority. But at that moment, his eyes were filled with something different: astonishment, recognition, and something that looked very much like reverence. Giancarlo began walking toward Clara, his footsteps echoing on the polished marble. Each step was deliberate, each movement laden with an emotion he didn't even try to hide. The conversations ceased completely now, replaced by a silence that seemed to carry its own weight. "My God," Giancarlo murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Clara Montero, it's really you." Enzo frowned, clearly confused. "Giancarlo, you know my employee?" The word employee slipped from his lips like an insult, but Giancarlo didn't even look at him. His eyes were fixed on Clara, who now held Sophia with one hand and Michael's hand with the other, looking like a modern Madonna amidst the social chaos surrounding her. "Employee?" Giancarlo repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "Enzo, you have no idea who you're talking to." He stopped in front of Clara, and for a moment, the two looked at each other in silence. There was history in that look, shared memories that no one else in the room could understand. Then, to the absolute shock of everyone present, Giancarlo reached out and embraced Clara tightly, as if he were hugging a long-lost treasure. "The best person I've ever met," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "The woman who saved my daughter." The room was so silent you could hear the ticking of the antique clocks adorning the walls. Enzo was speechless, his arrogance momentarily replaced by confusion. The other guests looked at each other, trying to understand what was happening. Clara, in turn, smiled for the first time that night. It wasn't a triumphant or vengeful smile. It was a smile of recognition, of silent gratitude for being seen for who she really was, not for what she appeared to be. "Hello, Giancarlo," she said softly. "Is Isabella all right?" "She is," he replied, tears glistening in his eyes. "She's in college now, studying music. She remembers you every day." Giancarlo turned to face the guests, his posture shifting from emotional to authoritative. He was, after all, not only the owner of the city's most prestigious restaurant, but also one of the country's most influential businessmen. When he spoke, people listened. "You want to know who Clara Montero is?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of years of accumulated gratitude. "She's the woman who saved my daughter when all the doctors, all the specialists, all the professionals had given up." Giancarlo closed his eyes for a moment, remembering those terrible days in Vienna. Isabella had lost her mother in a car accident, and since then she had completely withdrawn from the world. She didn't speak, she didn't eat, she showed no interest in life. The doctors spoke of severe depression, deep trauma, a child who had lost the will to live. He had tried everything: the best psychologists, the best doctors, the best specialists. Nothing worked. Isabella was wasting away before his eyes, and he felt completely helpless. Then Clara appeared, a young Brazilian woman who volunteered at the hospital, offering her time and music to children in need of healing. She hadn't lost her music. She had simply found a new way to express it. She hadn't wasted her talents. She had transformed them into something deeper and more meaningful. Giancarlo approached her once more, this time with a small card in his hand. "This is my personal card," he said. "When you're ready, give me a call. Let's start planning the program. And Clara," he paused, looking deeply into her eyes, "thank you for allowing me to be a part of your story again." Clara took the card with trembling hands. It was more than paper. It was a promise, a second chance, an opportunity to honor both her past and her future. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "for seeing me, for remembering me, for giving me hope." When she turned to leave, carrying Sophia and holding Michael's hand, the room was still in respectful silence. But it was a different silence than it had been at the beginning of the evening. It was a silence of reflection, of introspection, of people confronting their own assumptions about human worth and dignity. Enzo remained where he was, watching Clara walk away. There was something in his expression that no one had seen before, genuine humility, perhaps even admiration. For the first time in his life, he had encountered someone who made him feel small, not through intimidation or power, but through pure goodness. "Wait," he said suddenly, his voice louder than he intended. Clara stopped and turned, her expression patient and kind. I, I would like to contribute to the hospital program," he said, the words coming with difficulty. "Financially, I mean, if you would allow it." Clara studied him for a moment, seeing beyond the arrogance he had displayed, searching for something real and sincere in his eyes. And she found it. "It would be an honor," she said simply. "The children need all the help they can get." Enzo nodded, a small attempt at a smile appearing on his face. "Thank you," he murmured, for giving me a chance to do something right." As Clara finally left the hall, her words echoed in the minds of everyone present. She had transformed a night of humiliation into a life lesson, a moment of cruelty into an opportunity for growth. Giancarlo remained in the center of the hall for a few minutes after she left, looking at the door where she had disappeared. "You have just witnessed something extraordinary," he said to the guests who were still processing what had happened. "You saw how a truly great person behaves in the face of adversity. She didn't seek revenge. She didn't want to humiliate anyone back. She simply maintained her dignity and transformed pain into compassion." He paused, allowing his words to settle. "I hope we can all learn from her example. I hope we can remember this night whenever we are tempted to judge someone by their appearance, their profession, their social class, because we never know what kind of angel might be disguised among us." Outside the restaurant, Clara put the children in the car that was waiting for them. Sophia had woken up and was smiling, as if she could sense the shift in her caregiver's mood. Michael was full of questions about what had happened inside, but Clara just said that sometimes people need to be reminded how to treat each other with kindness. As the car drove away from Bellini's, Clara looked out the window at the city lights. She thought about her journey, all the ups and downs, all the losses and gains. She thought about her father, who had taught her that true success wasn't measured by applause or recognition, but by the positive impact you had on people's lives. She thought about Isabella, now a young woman studying music, carrying with her the lessons of hope and healing that Clara had planted in her heart years ago. She thought of all the children she had cared for as a nanny, all the little lives she had touched with her kindness and patience. And she thought about the future, about the music therapy program she was going to create, about the countless children she could help through music. She thought about how it would be to play again, not to impress critics or achieve fame, but to heal broken hearts and plant seeds of hope. That night, Clara Montero discovered something she had lost somewhere along her journey: the knowledge that she was exactly where she should be, doing exactly what she should be doing. She had found her purpose again, not in spite of her choices, but because of them. She took Giancarlo's card and held it to her chest, feeling the weight of the promise it represented. Tomorrow she would call him. Tomorrow she would start planning the program that would allow her to combine all the parts of who she was: the musician, the caregiver, the healer, the teacher. But today, she simply allowed herself to feel gratitude. Gratitude for being seen, for being remembered, for being valued for who she truly was. Gratitude for finding the strength to maintain her dignity in the face of cruelty. Gratitude for discovering that her music had never truly disappeared. It had simply found a new way to be expressed. As the car navigated the city streets, Clara began to softly hum a melody she had composed years ago, during her days as a volunteer at a Vienna hospital. It was a melody of hope, of healing, of new beginnings. Sophia, listening to the song, began to gently sway in Clara's lap. Michael, despite his age, sat quietly, instinctively knowing he was in the presence of something special. And Clara, for the first time in years, felt complete. She had learned that true greatness didn't come from applause or public recognition. It came from small acts of kindness, from silent sacrifices, from choosing love over selfishness, compassion over convenience. She had learned that her music was more powerful when used to heal than when used to impress. More importantly, she had learned that it was never too late for a fresh start, for a second chance, for finding a new purpose. Her story hadn't ended when she left the Viennese stages. She had merely reached the end of the first chapter. Now a new chapter was beginning, a chapter that promised to be even more meaningful than anything she had experienced before. When the car finally stopped in front of the house where she cared for the children, Clara got out with Sophia and Michael, helping them inside. After putting them to bed and singing a gentle lullaby, she sat in her small living room and looked at Giancarlo's card once more. She thought of all the children she could help, all the lives she could touch, all the families she could heal through music. She thought about teaching other musicians to use their talents for therapeutic purposes, about creating a program that could serve as a model for hospitals nationwide. But more than that, she thought about playing again, with purpose, with passion, with the certainty that her music was making a difference. She thought about waking up every day, knowing that her life had meaning, that her talents were being used for the greater good. That night, Clara Montero slept better than she had in years. She dreamt of music, of smiling children, of hospital rooms filled with hope and healing. She dreamt of a future where her story of pain and sacrifice would become a source of inspiration for others, where her losses would transform into gains for the people she served. And when she woke up the next morning, she knew exactly what she would do. She would call Giancarlo, accept his proposal, and begin working to create something beautiful and meaningful. She would play again, not to reclaim the fame she had lost, but to find the purpose that had always been waiting for her. Clara Montero had discovered that sometimes the greatest victories come disguised as defeats, that sometimes we find our true destiny only after losing our way. She had learned that humiliation can be transformed into humility, that pain can be transformed into compassion, that loss can be transformed into purpose. And so, the woman who had entered Bellini's as a simple caregiver left as an inspiration, a living lesson that a person's worth isn't determined by their social standing or financial success, but by the kindness in her heart and the impact they have on the lives of others. Her music had finally found its true audience, not sophisticated critics or art patrons, but hurting children who needed to hear that they weren't alone, that life was still worth living, that there was beauty and hope in the world, even in the darkest moments. And in that realization, Clara Montero found her true symphony, a composition of love, service, and healing that would echo through the lives of countless people for many years, a melody of hope that would continue to play long after the last notes had been sung. She wasn't a doctor, she wasn't a psychologist, she didn't have any official credentials, but she had something that all the professionals seemed to have lost: genuine compassion. "May I try playing for her?" Clara asked one day, with that soft voice that would become so familiar. Giancarlo was desperate. He would have tried anything. So he agreed, and Clara sat beside Isabella's bed with a simple, inexpensive, borrowed violin. The first piece she played was a composition of her own, something she had created in childhood. It was simple, but charged with an emotion that seemed to touch something deep within the listener's soul. Isabella didn't react the first day, nor the second, nor the third. But Clara returned every day, playing her melodies with the patience of someone who understood that true healing couldn't be rushed. It was in the second week that it happened. Isabella moved her eyes towards Clara. It was an almost imperceptible movement, but to Giancarlo, who had spent weeks searching for any sign of life in his daughter, it was like a miracle. "She's listening," he whispered to the nurse. "She's really listening." Day after day, Clara continued to play. And day after day, Isabella showed small signs of improvement. A finger movement following the rhythm, an almost invisible smile. Finally, in the third week, something extraordinary happened. Isabella spoke. "Can you teach me to play too?" she asked, her voice weak but clear. Giancarlo cried that day. He wept as he hadn't wept since the death of his wife. And when he saw Clara teaching his daughter to hold the violin, saw Isabella smile for the first time in months, he knew he was in the presence of something special. It wasn't just musical talent, it was humanity in its purest form. Back in the present, Giancarlo looked at Clara with the same love and gratitude from those days in Vienna. For 3 months, he continued, his voice echoing through the silent room, Clara went to the hospital every day. Every day she played for my daughter. Not because she was paid to do so, not because she received any recognition. She did it because she believed that music could heal, that compassion could work miracles. Enzo was clearly uncomfortable now. His confident posture had transformed into something defensive, his eyes searching for a way out of the situation he had created. That's very nice," he said, trying to regain control of the conversation. "But that doesn't change the fact that—" "Shut up," Giancarlo interrupted him, his voice sharp as a knife. "You have no right to speak. You spent the last 15 minutes publicly humiliating a woman who is worth more than you'll ever be, regardless of how much money you have in the bank." The room was now clearly divided. Some guests looked at Enzo with discomfort, realizing for the first time the cruelty of his words. Others still seemed confused, trying to process the dramatic turn of events. Clara remained calm, holding the children with her usual composure. But there was something different in her eyes now. It wasn't victory or revenge. It was a kind of peace, as if an old wound was finally healing. For those who follow stories of overcoming and human transformation, stories that remind us that our true essence transcends appearances and superficial judgments, keep following these accounts that touch the soul and challenge our perceptions of what truly matters in life. Giancarlo turned back to Clara, his expression softening. "After Isabella recovered," he continued, "I looked for you. I wanted to thank you. I wanted to offer you anything you needed. But you had disappeared. No one knew where you were." Clara smiled sadly. "I needed to go home. My father was ill." "And you abandoned your career to take care of him," Giancarlo said, not as a question, but a statement. "Of course you did, because that's what people like you do. They sacrifice their own dreams for the sake of others." Clara remembered the difficult days after her return to Brazil. Her father had survived the accident, but he would never be the same. He needed constant care, physical therapy, love, and patience. Clara sold everything she had of value, her violin, her jewelry, even the gowns she wore in performances, to pay the medical bills and ensure he had the best possible treatment. For 2 years, she was his primary caregiver. She helped him walk, fed him, bathed him, played music for him when the pain became unbearable. She gave up her identity as a musician to become simply a loving daughter. When he finally recovered enough to live independently, Clara discovered she no longer knew who she was. She was no longer the violin prodigy, no longer the rising star of the classical music world. She was just a 26-year-old woman without a career, without money, without direction. That's when she decided to become a nanny. Not because it was the only option available, but because she had discovered something during those years caring for her father. She had a gift for caring for others, especially children. "Do you want to know why Clara became a nanny?" Giancarlo asked, looking directly at Enzo. "It wasn't for lack of options. It was by choice. Because she understands something that people like you will never understand. That a person's worth isn't in what they have, but in what they give." Clara felt tears welling up in her eyes. Not tears of sadness or humiliation, but tears of gratitude. For years, she had carried a silent burden, a feeling that she had wasted her life, that she had thrown away her gifts. But hearing Giancarlo talk about her that way, seeing the respect and admiration in his eyes, made her realize something fundamental. She hadn't wasted anything. She had simply transformed her gifts into something different, something equally valuable. She had exchanged applause for love, fame for meaning, success for service. Enzo was visibly shaken now. His arrogance had turned into embarrassment, his confidence into confusion. He looked around the room, searching for allies, for people who shared his worldview. But the looks he met were of discomfort, judgment, silent disapproval. I, I, I didn't know," he stammered, his voice losing all the strength it had before. "If I had known—" "If you had known what?" Clara asked softly, speaking directly to Enzo for the first time. "Would you have treated me with respect? Would you have treated me like a human being worthy of it?" Enzo opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out, because he knew, as everyone else in the room knew, that the answer was obvious. He would have treated her better if he had known her story, which meant he hadn't treated her well simply because she seemed inferior to him. "The point," Clara continued, her voice maintaining the same gentle calmness, "isn't that you should treat me well because I have an impressive story. The point is you should treat everyone well, regardless of their background, because we are all human beings worthy of respect." The ensuing silence was profound and meaningful. Clara had done more than defend herself. She had given a lesson in humanity that touched everyone in the room. Giancarlo smiled, proud. "Isabella will be so happy to know I found you," he said. "She always asks me about the music angel who saved her life." "Music angel?" Clara asked, smiling for the first time with genuine joy that night. "That's what she calls you. She says you came down from heaven with your violin to show her that life was still worth living." Clara felt her heart warm. For years, she had wondered if she had made the right choice by abandoning her career. She had wondered if her music truly made a difference in people's lives. Now, finally, she had her answer. "Giancarlo," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "you can't imagine how much this means to me. I, I spent so much time wondering if I'd wasted my gifts, if I'd made the right decisions." "Wasted?" Giancarlo shook his head vehemently. "Clara, you used your gifts in the noblest way possible. You didn't just play for elegant audiences in luxurious concert halls. You played for a child who needed to hear that she wasn't alone. You played to heal, not to impress." He turned to face the guests again, his voice gaining strength. "Do you want to know what true greatness is? It's not having money in the bank or wearing expensive clothes or frequenting the right places. True greatness is sacrificing your own dreams to save the life of a child you don't even know. True greatness is choosing service over fame, choosing love over profit." Clara looked at Enzo, who seemed to have shrunk during the last minute. There were no longer any traces of arrogance in his posture, only embarrassment and, perhaps, something that looked like regret. "Mr. Bellini," she said, her voice gentle, "I don't hold a grudge. I understand that we all judge sometimes, We all make assumptions based on appearances. I only hope that tonight reminds us all that we never truly know who is before us." Enzo looked up to meet her gaze. There was something different in his eyes now, a vulnerability that wasn't there before. I, I apologize," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "I was wrong. Completely wrong." "Thank you," Clara replied simply. "We appreciate the apology." Giancarlo moved even closer to Clara, as if to make sure she was real, that this encounter wasn't just a dream. "Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I have a request to make. Actually, I have a proposition." Clara looked at him curiously, Sophia still sleeping peacefully in her arms. "I want you to play again," he said. "Not necessarily the way you played before, but the way you know how to play best. I want you to play to heal, to inspire, to touch hearts." He paused, looking around the room. "I want to create a program at the Children's Hospital here, a music therapy program, and I want you to be the director. Not as charity, not as a favor, but as a partnership. You would have all the resources you need, all the instruments, all the support." Clara felt her heart race. The possibility of combining her passion for music with her love for helping others was something she had dreamed of but never dared to expect. I I don't know what to say," she murmured. "Say yes," Giancarlo smiled. "Isabella would be so proud. And you could finally do what you were born to do. Use your music to heal the world, one note at a time." Clara looked around the room, seeing the faces watching her. Some still looked confused, others excited, some clearly touched by the story they had witnessed. But all, somehow, seemed different than they were at the beginning of the night. "There's one condition," Clara said finally. "Anything," Giancarlo replied immediately. "I want the program to be open to all children, regardless of their financial situation. There should be no difference between rich and poor, between privileged and disadvantaged. Music is for everyone." Giancarlo smiled, tears of pride shining in his eyes. "Of course," he said. "It couldn't be any other way." That's when something magical happened. One of the guests, an elegant woman who had been observing the whole scene in silence, began to applaud. Slowly, other people joined her, until the entire room was applauding. But it wasn't the kind of applause Clara used to receive in her performances. It wasn't applause for technical virtuosity or for an impressive performance. It was applause for humanity, for courage, for dignity in the face of adversity. Clara felt tears roll down her cheeks, not tears of sadness, but tears of deep gratitude. She had spent years wondering if her life had meaning, if her choices had been worthwhile. Now, finally, she had her answer. Michael, who had watched the whole scene with the wide eyes of a child trying to understand the adult world, tugged on Clara's skirt. "Anna," he whispered, "are you famous?" Clara knelt down to be at eye level with the boy, Sophia still sleeping peacefully in her arms. "No, Michael," she said softly, "I'm not famous, but I am happy." And it was true. For the first time in years, Clara felt complete. Not because she had been publicly vindicated, not because her story had been told, but because she finally understood that her journey, all the losses, all the sacrifices, all the tears, had led to this moment of clarity.